We are now heading into what is basically Unit 3, Period 3. I'm going to start by going through the French and Indian War, the Seven Years' War. Then we'll get into kind of the long-term and short-term causes of the revolution, and then finally the war. So this is going to stretch out over a bunch of videos. All right, so let's get started. All right, so first thing we want to talk about is the Ohio River Valley. Um, as you might notice as we're looking at the map, and we can begin to notice that this red area represents the original 13 colonies, and essentially the British have control over access to the Atlantic Ocean, right? Cool. The French, on the other hand, are stuck up here in what is Canada. Now, we talked about this one of the earliest videos, maybe the first video, about the challenges of the French colony. One of the big issues they have is it's Canada. It is real cold. They have a very short growing season. It does not really lend itself to agriculture. So that means that what they can do economically is really limited. It's limited to essentially the fur trade, which, listen, they'll make money doing it, but it does not lend itself to having a large colony, which is why when we get close to the start of this war, there's only few 10,000s of people, like I think 40 to 50,000 people living in all of New France and Canada. That's not a huge population. All right. Meanwhile, you have the English who are hugging the coast over here in the on eastern United part of the United States. They're having a different problem. They are basically having a problem where they're continuing to explode. On the eve of this, we're talking about a population of approaching 2 million people. Now, 2 million people should comfortably be able to fit into this region. There's a lot of land, considering that, you know, Mecklenburg County has 1 million people in it. But the challenge they're running into is all that good land we talked about in the earlier videos was taken by the original inhabitants, the people who came here first, leaving the people who came later to go live in the Appalachian Mountains. So they're living on garbage land. So what do they want desperately? They want better land. So this is where the fight comes in. You have the French who are stuck up here in Canada who are desperate to get down here. You have the British who are beginning to become, quote, overcrowded and want better land for them. So everyone keeps thinking, if I can get the Ohio River Valley, that will drastically change the landscape of my colony. The French will get land that is more agriculturally friendly. The British will get more land that would give them a release valve, if you will, to people in flatland in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. Oh, yeah. And the last thing I want to mention really quickly here is that even though this is inland, you still have the Ohio River connecting to the Mississippi. The Mississippi gets the Gulf of Mexico and then out. So even though they're inland United States, they don't have the coastal access like they do right here. They still have the ability to move products, get things in, communicate, transportation. All of that is still very possible because the Ohio River runs down to the Mississippi and out to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Ohio River Valley, as weird as it sounds, actually becomes a kind of important region for both both international powers as they begin to try to change the future of their colonies. Now, what starts this war is essentially the conflict of Fort Necessity. Now, if we were to go back and look at the map we did when we talked about this, we'll notice there's a place called Pittsburgh, right? And Pittsburgh is essentially at the start of the Ohio River. The French controlled this region. They had something called Fort Duquesne or Duquesne for those who are uneducated. Um, and what the British realized is that they need control of Pittsburgh because this is where the two rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny, come together to form the Ohio. If they control that, then they can control the Ohio River downstream, and the Ohio River Valley gets a lot easier to both conquer, but also just for trade. So George Washington is sent out with a small force from Virginia, a colonial force, not the British regulars, to try to seize Fort Duquesne and force the French out. Now, keep in mind, he's from Virginia. He's marching to Pennsylvania. Why does he or people from Virginia care? Because wealthy Virginians had purchased a whole bunch of land in Ohio and were hoping that they could sell it one day for huge profits once it came under British control. So they were basically speculating. So George Washington gets sent out there with a small colonial force. Unfortunately, the French know he's coming, and so George is then kind of trap. And so he'll build what we remember we talked about this Fort Necessity where they put the cannon on the outside. Smart. Anyway, what happens is George and his small force have to build Fort Necessity to try to protect themselves from the French. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and George Washington is forced to retreat. Now, why do we care about Fort Necessity? All right, it is the official first battle of the French Indian War or the 7 Years' War. So this rinky-dink little thing, this little small skirmish in the middle of western Pennsylvania, is what will kickstart a global war. Because don't forget, the 7 Years' War takes place in the Caribbean, in Europe, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, and here. It is a massive global war. We just tend to think of it as the war that was fought here. So Fort Necessity is the first kickstart. It also begins to introduce George Washington to the colonial people, and begin to see, man, this guy's a terrible general because he lost here and then he'll lose a little bit later too. All right, now that we're kind of in the conflict, we see the Albany Plan of Union emerge. Big name we want to know from this is Ben Franklin. All right, Ben Franklin will organize a meeting in Albany, New York, and as you can see here from this drawing, the whole point of this is essentially unify the colonies into one unified system. And so they come up with a plan. All right, this plan is going to sound awfully familiar. So first, they're going to have a legislative body where people from every colony will come and have an opportunity to vote. Okay. They also create a second layer, which is essentially a executive. So, why is this significant? Two things. One, uh, it's the colonies for the first time, really as a collection, beginning to try to unify with some form of government. All right, so that's significant. The other significance is that you notice that the system they set up sounds awfully familiar, right? Like we're going to have an executive with a legislative body beneath them. All right, so everyone goes to the meeting, loves the plan. They go back, and the colonies reject it. All right. They weren't interested in sharing power with other colonies. I think they were very much afraid that the big colonies would dominate the little colonies. So, back in the colonies, this is a no go. But more importantly, it's a no go in England as well. If you're the king looking at this, right, you're going, wait, so if they're going to have a legislative body and an executive, they don't need a king or parliament anymore. So the king firmly comes out against this, and even if it had gone forward with approval by the colonial governments, it likely would have been shut down by parliament and the king. But the more significant thing is that we're beginning to see the colonies at least attempting to organize. All right, the common enemy isn't the British yet, it's going to be the French at this point, but we're getting to the point where the colonies are getting organized. All right, so skipping ahead here a little bit. When the war begins, the British are getting their butts whooped, right? If you remember, we looked at this stuff at the beginning of the year. The French had forts all up and down rivers. They had fortifications. So it became very difficult for the British to invade New France. And they were getting their butts kicked. Their lead commander, General Braddock, who, with the quote, help of Washington, tries to take Fort Duquesne again, but this time it goes even worse, where Braddock himself will be killed. Washington will nearly be killed as he's basically the British are forced to retreat. So it's going very badly for the British. They're getting their butts whooped. And then in steps William Pitt. William Pitt becomes the new Prime Minister of England. And the couple terms we want to know here, right, is the blank check policy. So William Pitt is willing to basically use what this blank check policy. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, let's go. So he begins to rack up massive amounts of debt to fight the war. Now, why does this matter? Why is this significant? So here's the thing. One of the leading causes of the war, or the revolution, I should say, is going to be this, the British start taxing us. Well, why do they start taxing us? Because they have a lot of war debt to pay off. The problem was most of that debt was unrelated to us. The colonists, the colonies represent a very small part of this war, but the British start expecting them to pay. So William Pitt is going to help win the war, but he's also going to help kickstart the revolution by basically throwing tons and tons of money at this French Indian War and causing lots and lots of debt. All right, now the war will end. The Treaty of Paris, the first one in 1763. So a couple things we should note. The British basically get a whole ton of land, right? They go from being this tiny little red thing to basically being all of this. So Going back to the Ohio River Valley thing for a second, right? You would then think they got all this land. That major problem that basically drove the British to want to go to Ohio should be solved because now they got all this land. You'd be wrong. Um, the other thing it does is it sets up a very, not that, listen, the British and French have fought forever, right? Like cats and dogs, one of the biggest rivalries in like geopolitical history. The problem was the French always lose. All right. So here's the thing, the French always lose. They're angry, they're pissed off. So when we jump ahead to the American Revolution, they're going to be looking for a chance for revenge, right? Because in this war, they got their butts whooped and lost essentially everything that was here now belongs to the British. Now, here's the problem. We begin to see um, violent uprisings by Native Americans who were living what was French controlled territory. The most famous one is led by Pontiac. So Pontiac is here in Michigan. And when the British come to him and say, congratulations, you're now a British citizen, it's like, the hell I am. It's like, oh, and by the way, you have to live by our rules. And as we kind of alluded to in the past, the French, they understood how to deal with Native Americans. They had a good relationship with them. The British never did. And so the French are the Native Americans are very aware of that. So what do? They begin to have violent attacks up and down what is essentially the frontier line in Western New York and Pennsylvania. And the British have to try their best to put it down. Now, here's the thing. They don't want to, after a long war, they don't want to devote a ton of resources and manpower to this stuff. So what are they going to do? They're going to come up with a solution, which is the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is essentially this big red line that runs like this. So what did the British do? They drew an imaginary line through the Appalachian Mountains and told the British colonists, all right, here's the deal. Can't go across the line. They didn't enforce it. They didn't put soldiers there. They basically don't go across the line. If you go across the line, you're on your own. Did people listen? Hell no. They went across the line and they were on their own. The reason the British made the British mad is that it potentially could provoke a war with Pontiac and other tribes who expected to be left alone. Here's the thing. This is a kind of significant thing. It's the first attempt by the British government, all right, to start controlling the colonies in a more serious way. Salvatore neglect had left them alone. Now the British are beginning to say, no, 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 no. You have to listen to us. That's the problem. Also, from a colonial standpoint, one, they don't want to be told by the British government what to do. But from their viewpoint is we just fought a war. We just died. Lives were lost. This property was destroyed and you're going to start taxing us to pay for the war which we just fought. And the reason we fought the war was to go here and get all this good flat land. And now you're telling me I can't have it? Yeah, that kind of pissed off the colonists. All right, so what we're going to do now is we'll pause it here and we'll pick up with the next video for what are the short term causes or the long term causes of the war.